The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here for what's going to be a fantastic discussion with Pierre-Olivier Ouellet and Clarence Epstein. And I'm honored to be your host this evening and to be able to interview them both. I want to start with this slide. We're looking at a young William Raphael, and here he is, and this is a situation of his home in Prussia. And so what happens, Pierre-Olivier, you write in your book that William Raphael, before he has left Prussia, before he comes to Canada, he has already changed his name from Israel Rafalski to William Raphael. And if there has ever been chutzpah, that is chutzpah, to name yourself after one of the greatest painters who ever lived. So this is what I'd love to know. Tell us a little bit about him, and where did he get all that chutzpah, and how did he arrive here in Canada?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Sarah. So William Raphael, grew up in the town of Nakel in the far eastern part of Prussia. Now it will be named Poland. And he was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family with several children. And he learned 3 languages at a very young age: German, Hebrew, and also Yiddish. In short, just like me. English was not his mother tongue. By the way, I just want to apologize in advance if I stumble, if my pace is a bit slow at times. But I hope nonetheless that you will be able to follow my remarks during this discussion. So as I said, William Raphael was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family, but during Raphael's youth, the region where he lived in Eastern Europe was an important center for what we call the Ashkara, or the Jewish Enlightenment. So he was in a movement that encouraged the modernization of Jewish communities through a more secular education and also culture. And so, as a matter of fact, he, even if he came from a relatively modest family, modest background, he was able to take music lessons. He played violin, and also he read Romantic poetry, and he studied also the ancient history. And as a teenager, he also began drawing and taking notes into his sketchbooks, and I bet he kept up throughout his life. And a very important step was taken by William Raphael on August 1851. At that time, at the eve of his 18th birthday, he decided to leave his family and to pursue a formal artistic training. He attended then at the Royal Prussian Academy of Arts, which is located in Berlin. And it was a very important institution, and an institution that was founded in the late of the 17th century. And there, the school had several teachers which were well known in the Berlin society of the time, just like Karl Joseph Begas. So he had the occasion to learn from them, from all these teachers, and he found himself combining various influences to develop his own artistic identity. And what we see here is also some studies that he made, sketches of human anatomy, because, for example, he did represent human skulls and also leg muscles, as we see. And that reminds us that in Berlin, there was a professor of anatomical drawing, and students were even allowed to draw from cadavers at that time, of course, under the guidance of a teacher. So what is less known is that these skills would serve William Raphael well, because many years after his arrival in Montreal in 1857, he created anatomical images for the famous Dr. William Osler. Osler was a Canadian physician, and he was also described as one of the fathers of modern medicine. And so he made some drawings that were published in one of the Dr. Osler's book in 1880.
So what you're saying, Pierre-Olivier, is that he really had a confidence and ability and a training by the time that he came to Montreal, right?
Yes, of course.
So now I want to ask Clarence a question, because Clarence is an expert on 19th century Montreal. And so tell us, Clarence, in your opinion, what was Montreal like when Raphael arrived there?
So around 1850, Montreal was really a city divided. It was a city wherein the French-Canadian population was being outrun by a large British colonial immigration that was starting to dictate not only colonial policy, but also social, religious, and cultural policy. And in that regard, before Raphael came, there were some critical moments that were to determine the kind of Montreal that Raphael was to arrive in. The first thing was in 1847, there was a very controversial bill called the Rebellion Losses Bill, which awarded compensation to French Canadians who battled against the British in those rebellions. And it got the British very upset. And as a result, there was a great dispute between the two factions, which eventually led to the burning of the Houses of Parliament. The Houses of Parliament that were in Montreal effectively determined, good government in the city, which now there was no longer. And by the early 1850s, that tension between the French-Canadian population and the British colonial population began to show itself in other ways. And the means by which that showed itself were in part as a result of the arrival of the Irish, who were neither really British nor French-Canadian, but they were Catholic. And so as a result, there was a kind of a medium between them and the two populations. And they were recruited to build the Victoria Bridge, which at the time was the penultimate construction in Canada. All of this happened around the time when there was a great fire in Montreal, 1852. That fire demolished a quarter of the city, and so gave an opportunity for builders and developers and artists and impresarios to imagine what the city was going to look like. And if you can go back to the other slide, I'll explain those two images, which in effect are one of the burning of Moses Judah Hayes' house. Moses Judah Hayes was the most important businessman in Montreal at the time, responsible for entertainment. He was a Jew, and he was the first shopping center owner, and that was a shopping center, what you're seeing, with theaters, bars, restaurants, and in effect, that housed the Houses of Parliament after the Great Fire. And so on one hand, you see one view of Montreal kind of burning in the 1850s, and on the other side, you see a Montreal growing as a result of British colonial investment, and you see the building of the Bank of Montreal, which was, in effect, the scion of the establishment of the city, all happening really at the same time.
And so then we see William Raphael's painting up on screen. And can you tell us, how does he see the city? What does he want to do?
So Raphael arrives to a city where there was an existing artist establishment. And for him, that's not easy to find himself or to locate his own artwork. The artists that were in the previous slide, Cornelius Krieghoff and James Duncan, were preeminent in Quebec and in Montreal at the time, both having very different styles of painting. Artists like Théophile Hamel and Joseph Légaré and Reinhold Jacobi were all on the scene at the same time, but they hadn't really defined themselves as clearly as artists like Krieghoff and Duncan. And so Raphael, when he arrives, also wants to portray the Montreal that he sees based on his training and based on his view of the land or the city. And so the paintings that you see on both these sides are paintings of the same area called Victoria Square, at the time called Haymarket Square. On the left was James Duncan's view of it, which he was capturing another riot that happened in Montreal, pitting Catholics against Protestants. So it was bad enough if you were pitting French Canadians against English Canadians, you were pitting Protestants against Catholics, who were then divided religiously. And he captured a very different Haymarket Square than William Raphael did on the right. But in William Raphael's case, Raphael is depending on a new advent that is coming through in Montreal, which is photography, and wherein Notman, who is the preeminent photographer of Canada, is setting himself up at the same time as Raphael. And Raphael is borrowing both cinematographic ideals, but he's also bringing his own tradition, like Pierre-Olivier said, of his German training, and wherein styles like Biedermeier were becoming prevalent in his work. And so Raphael comes in and introduces his own language to the city.
That's such an important segue to my next question, which is, here is William Notman, that Clarence mentioned, who was the most important photographer, in fact, the first pioneering photographer in Canada at the time. So amazingly, we read in your book, Pierre-Olivier, that William Raphael gets a job working for Notman. One of the things he's doing is he begins coloring photographs. He then starts to create portraits, and he becomes quite well known for his portraits. But what I loved in your book, Pierre-Olivier, is that you talk about how he really began to define a style of his own, which was really about genre painting, like the work that we see on screen. And can you tell us a little bit about what is genre painting, and why was William Raphael's work in it so important to the formulation of Canadian art?
Yes, of course, you did very well in just pinpointing the fact that at first William Raphael was working, well, portraits, and also working for William Notman in 1859. He worked just, maybe 1 year, maybe just a few months for the photographer, and Notman was very important in the Montreal artistic scene because he was offering, he had such a wonderful studio, and combining photography and also painting, and that allowed him to hire a lot of artists. And William Raphael was one of the first of these, and he worked for Notman, but this practice, of course, provided him with a steady income, but it did not necessarily align with the young artist's ambitions, because, as you said, what he wanted to do was genre scenes that would be more freely done, intended to be exhibited, and also to be sold. In fact, what we see here with the Old Peddler is one of his first artworks that was noted by the Montreal press at that time in September 1859. So you have the newspaper, the Montreal Herald, that published some very positive lines about the painting. And it was at that time on display at a bookseller, Vitrine Boutique, Dawson and Son. And so with this painting, what we can discover is this association of Raphael, what with Clarence said was the Biedermeier style. So the Biedermeier style is an artistic movement that was prominent in Central Europe in the second quarter of the 19th century. And that seems to, this Biedermeier style, have colored the artistic vision of William Raphael, and during his formative years in Berlin. And for the Biedermeier, what is important is realism. So you have to see now the Old Peddler, and you can see how the artist aimed to present subjects from everyday life, people in a household. Is very meticulous in his composition, and also to depict all the objects and also the people as realistically as possible. So this was a very important painting for the beginning of his career. And over the years, he continued his personal work, focusing on genre scenes, depicting Canadian people and also the landscape. So if you go to the first one, the tandem that we saw earlier, Sara, just the first slide, yeah. We see here this painting entitled Tandem, and Raphael shows interesting themes that had been scarcely explored at the time. You can see here the children that are, without any doubt, pleased with the speed of their sled. They make funny faces, and you can even see the one on the left. He smiles very broadly, and he shows to the young driver how to place his hands to control the steering. So these children have managed to turn the winter chore of fetching firewood into a game. And of course, Raphael's art is not necessarily humorous. That said, like these smiling characters that we see in this painting Tandem, he occasionally liked to incorporate cheerful elements, revealing aspects of his own temperament.
So Pierre-Olivier, one of the things that so many people are interested in knowing in this room is more about the fact that that William Raphael is known as being the first Jewish artist in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
And I would love, Clarence, for you to talk to us a bit about what we're seeing on screen now, and how did his Judaism play into his art? Did it, in fact?
So I think it's first important to frame the history of the Montreal Jewish community in Montreal, which dates to the 1770s, arriving with the British, servicing the British garrisons, and providing numerous forms of products and services to those military. And in the late 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, they weren't as prevalent, really. They were a very small population. They were trying to integrate. And what was a critical moment was in 1830s when there was an Emancipation Act that allowed Jewish people in British North America to freely vote, to have the same rights that other British people did. And that was kind of an important turning point for the Jews of Montreal, and it allowed them to build their first house of worship, Custom, which you see on the left here. Another illustration, again, by James Duncan, who was really the ultimate kind of artist capturing the zeitgeist of the city from century to century. And I was noticing, even in the vitrines of the reception, that you have drawings of synagogues in Toronto. And what you see, and what is very typical of synagogues, including those in Montreal in the 1800s, was that they intentionally deviated from the assimilationist Gothic and classical views of churches and wanted to define their own style. And so the Spanish and Portuguese Jews chose a Mediterranean style with Egyptian configurations on their building to differentiate themselves. And so William Raphael, arriving to a Montreal that had as a differentiator a Spanish and Portuguese history, he leaned in first and foremost to the rabbi of the synagogue, Rabbi Abraham de Sola. And de Sola, who this is not a portrait of, as Pierre-Olivier has confirmed, although we wish it was, it would make it even more interesting, was the preeminent Jewish intellectual in Canada, someone who had already come educated, not unlike Raphael, coming educated to the city, a rabbi that was eventually invited to join the faculty of McGill University. And Raphael moved in towards that synagogue congregation, despite the fact that there was a burgeoning German population that was arriving in the city around the same time as him. And so with the connections of Abraham de Sola and Abraham de Sola's brother-in-law, Aaron Hart David, Raphael started connecting with some of the elite in the city, not only the Jewish elite, but because de Sola and Aaron Hart David were connected to the Montreal elite, he began making connections through them, and I believe strongly that his introductions to William Osler came likely from de Sola and David, and Osler being the preeminent medic and faculty member at McGill in those years, was the one who commissioned Raphael for all those anatomical drawings that you've seen. So the Jewish connections were very important, albeit they couldn't rely for Raphael on his commissions. He needed to find other patrons to support his work, and invariably he had to mix genres and portraiture and landscape and historical painting to try and make a living. And what's interesting about this particular view is that it combines many of those elements in one work, notably that there is a figure with a yarmulke sitting in a canoe with a lady, in very much in Victorian dress, fishing somewhere on the outskirts of the city. And the fact that he was combining his own experiences, but ensuring that this work might not be recognized as a Jewish couple on a canoe, but to anyone who might want to purchase it as a couple in a canoe, was one way that Raphael kind of mixed his identities as a Jewish Montrealer and as an artist to many patrons.
So he really was incredibly savvy in terms of how he was working. His ability, his reach was quite extensive. And with the slide that we're looking at right now, Pierre-Olivier, he ended having tremendous commissions across the city. We can see here the famous Bon Secours Market. Tell us a bit about how he became really esteemed and very well respected.
Yes, well, from the outset, it should be noted that William Raphael was highly involved in the Montreal and also the Canadian cultural scene. So he was known not only as very into the development of the arts, but also the arts education. And after a few years settling in Montreal, he became part of the new Montreal dynamic driven by a growing enthusiasm for arts. And in this reality, so he was one of the first members of the Art Association of Montreal that was formed in Montreal in 1860, and he was one of the two artists that were invited to take part into the discussions for the initial thinking of this project. And so when the Art Association was formed, he was also one of the first painters to exhibit some of his works in the exhibitions in Montreal. So he played really an active role in the association activities. And moreover, it's within the Art Association of Montreal that one of the Raphael's work became one of his first major success. And unfortunately, this success was the Bon Secours Market, a painting that we don't have anymore. Maybe it's located somewhere in Toronto. You can help us if you know where. But still, this painting made in 1864, we don't know where it is now. But nevertheless, 2 years later, he made this other painting that you see there that is behind Bon Secours Market, and it was also a great success. And it is now known as one of his more famous compositions because you see this piece reflects the spirit of the Biedermeier style. You can see this very big emphasis on realism, and he tried to show the day-to-day reality, the everyday activity that we could see in Montreal. It is a very lively scene in which we can see that people are conversing. There is a fiddler that is playing his instrument, and also we can almost hear the clatter of the horses resound on the streets. So so it was very important. And for the years from the mid-60s to the 1880s, he was known as one of the more important painter of the time, and was very significant because he was one of the members of the Society of Canadian Artists that was founded in 1867. There's more of that because in 1879, he also became a member of the Ontario Society of Artists here in Toronto, an association that was founded 7 years earlier. And so he had the opportunity in 1879 to present 4 of his works here in Toronto, and it had tremendous success. And at the same time that he at this exhibition, he showed for the first time this painting that you see here on your right. It's the Indian encampment on the lower St. Lawrence estuary, made in 1879. And this painting is another famous painting made by William Raphael. And it was not only important for him as a painting, but also because it was the opportunity for him to get attention from the Governor General of Canada at the time, the Marquis de Lorne, and also his wife, the Princess Louise. So these two great persons went to the exhibition in Toronto. They were very impressed with the paintings, and also it was in Toronto that was decided to make a Royal Academy of Arts. And what is very interesting is the fact that at that time, in 1879, when it was in the air to make this academy, there is this painter, Eustace O'Brien, in Toronto, that decided to make a list to propose to the Governor General of a few artists that could be made academician for this new institution. And on the 8 artists that he selected, there was the name of William Raphael. So he was really, really important, as you can see at that time. And the painting, as you can see on the right, is very incredible, because you can see that the artist was not only showing a great landscape of the province of Quebec. Maybe you know the place. It's in, at the time we called this place Murray Bay. Today it's La Malbaie. And we can see the Mont Blanc cliff. And also you can see a few indigenous people that are there. And what is interesting is how he made also this moonlit sky. So he played a lot with the understanding of the various lights, that not only the silvery light of the moon that we see here that reached the waves below, but also there is the fire in one of the teepees, or even the beam from the lighthouse that shines out to the sea. So it's a painting as famous as Behind Bon Secours Market, and these two paintings are were the two main paintings that were shown in history books until now, when we are interested in William Raphael.
And yet, I really want to ask, I'm going to turn this question to you, Clarence. So Pierre-Olivier, he was an artist who was technically, he had a mastery in terms of commissions. He was really well commissioned in Montreal, in Ontario, well known. And yet, I would be willing to say that most people in this room have never, ever heard of William Raphael. I certainly, as somebody who had done a PhD, I had never heard of him before you came forth and told me that you wanted to do a book for the Art Canada Institute, and we were thrilled. So I'm going to ask Clarence this. What happened? You're an art historian in Montreal. Why don't we know him better?
Or is the question you're really asking, was he canceled? And it's a big question with a complicated set of answers. First of all, as Pierre-Olivier was saying, he was reaching his apogee in the 70s, and by the 1880s, something happened. And what is it that happened that kind of turned his career around? And when you see these images or these portraits of himself, as somebody on the left that appears like a European old master painter with that confidence of a Rubens or a Van Dyck, or the more mature, seasoned educator that you see here, who is an artist but also a mentor and a teacher, and then finally, much later on, an artist who's a lot more resigned, who's in his studio, who's not really getting himself ready for the picture as much as he just wants to portray himself in his real state. And so the answer is all likely that many things happened at the same time. One is, as an educator, he was being challenged by other artists and educators who were coming onto the scene in Montreal and were not as interested anymore in his style of teaching or his way of educating the next generation of artists. That's one thing I think that was important in why there was a turning. The second element was likely his style. I think his style was probably reaching a peak. There were other artists that had traveled to France and were bringing new forms of thinking to the city. And as a result, they were competing also for a way to replace him. And the third one, which I think we all have to believe is true, is that there was a root of anti-Semitism that was in the city that was in all likely kicked off in Europe by the assassination of the Tsar in the 1880s, with reverberations across Eastern Europe, with all these Eastern European Jews then migrating to North America and causing great concern to the intellectuals of British North America as well as the United States about these waves of Jews coming in and what they were doing to the city. And Raphael was kind of caught in the middle of this. Somebody who obviously was from a previous generation of Jewish intelligentsia, but unfortunately was caught in the criticism that the Gentile intellectuals of the time, both French-Canadian and English-Canadian, were presenting to the Canadian population about the Jewish problem. It's a trope, unfortunately, that we see being cyclical in Jewish history. It's a situation we see today in the cycles of how Jewish communities are perceived, both locally and historically, in Canada. And unfortunately, we have to imagine that Raphael had a similar experience, albeit with a combination of other career factors that were against him.
So in a way, he sort of fell out of history, and yet, in terms of the way that art historians saw him, he never really fell out of value or importance. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit, Pierre-Olivier, about what we're seeing on screen. It's an auction in 2015, and what happened?
Yes, well, it's like a complete reversal of fortune, if we can say that, because for a long time after William Raphael's death, his work was not particularly highlighted in art history publications, nor were his paintings especially collected by museum institutions. That said, the importance of that work that we see here, the Bon Secours Market, Montreal, 1880, could not be silenced. And it is a very significant painting that was put in the art market, and it was impossible for the institutions in Canada to remain completely indifferent. As a matter of fact, as you said, in 2015, the National Gallery of Canada decided to spend more than $300,000 to buy this painting at Christie's auction in the United Kingdom. This to acquire this painting of William Raphael. And in fact, they paid an amount that was about 6 times the highest estimate of around $50,000. So that shows us that this acquisition was very important. And also, the then director of the National Gallery of Canada, Marc Meyer, also stated, and I quote him, the acquisition of this exquisite painting is particularly noteworthy in that it repatriates an important historical work of art to Canada. Its purchase further enhances our extensive holdings of work of art for the benefits of all Canadians, end of the quotation. So this exceptional painting, its sale in 2015, the bidding war also it sparked, and finally its acquisition by the National Gallery of Canada brought William Raphael back into the spotlight and reaffirmed his significance of his work in the history of Canadian art. And in this artwork in particular, you can see that Raphael captures a moment alive with vendors. You can see indigenous people, habitants, and also children. And in this painting, rather than celebrating elites, you can see that Raphael is more interested to finding dignity into ordinary people. He's trying to catch their gestures, their conversations, their daily routines, and the result is just like a collective portrait of Canada in its formative years. You can see that people that are painted are hardworking, they are also in motion, and through works like this, we can say that Raphael shows the story of a nation that can be traced through its people.
It's incredible. And one thing, so last question, and I'm going to ask Clarence about this. So one of the things I've really loved working on with you on this book, being its publisher, having the Art Canada Institute publish it, is that there's a really beautiful personal story when we come to looking at William Raphael. And that is that although the Canadians just caught on to the importance of William Raphael in 2015, there is somebody who we see on screen here who I'm happy to say is in our audience, Jonathan Wiener. And Clarence, tell us a little bit about him and his role in the story.
Okay, I don't want to speak about Jonathan without him approving what I say, but so Jonathan is an immensely successful real estate developer, visionary who founded Canderel in the 1970s, and it's probably around that time that he started investigating the works of Raphael, but I hadn't really known about that until I met him in the later 1990s at Concordia University, where I was running the Cultural Affairs Division, and Jonathan was the chair of the Real Estate Planning Committee and was rolling out a vision for the university that was spectacular and bold and was exciting to be around him. And during those years, we worked on public art projects, and as a result of those public art projects, I would often come to visit Jonathan in his offices in Montreal. And one day, I was in his office, and there happened to be a master's thesis there. The thesis was that of Sharon Goldman, who I think is here as well.
Also in the audience.
And I started flitting through this thesis, and he started explaining to me this labor of love that he was committed to. And over the years, he would talk about his conquests and acquiring pieces and finding them in countries in Europe, of contacting people in the city and abroad who had connections with the story of Raphael. And you could tell that he was clearly enamored of everything about his great-great-great-grandfather.
Great-great-grandfather.
Great-great-grandfather. What happened ultimately for me, the three greats, great-great-great-grandfather. Okay, so what happened, I happened to be in New York the same day as the sale, and you can put back that painting when it was going up for auction in London. And a mutual friend of ours, Jonathan and mine, was in New York with me, and we were at a gallery. And we knew the sale was coming up. This was the Winkworth collection, one of the most important collections of Canadiana that was outside of Canada. And there were going to be bidders from all the major Canadian institutions. So my friend and I were standing in front of the screen watching the bidding as it was going on in London. And we saw this painting go up, and the number kept going up and up and up and up until it was finally sold. And we were hoping that it was Jonathan that got it, because we knew for sure that this was really in his focus. Anyway, we went on to the rest of the day. We didn't call him. We didn't really have any knowledge of what was going on. And the next day, we gave him a call. And on that call, we were like, Jonathan, did you get the painting? And you can read this actually in the article in CBC, because he told his wife the same answer he told us. He goes, I have bad news and I have good news. He goes, the bad news is I didn't get the painting. The good news is the National Gallery bought it, and all the other Raphaels are worth a lot more. And I thought that was a wonderful kind of bittersweet answer. And so Jonathan is the ultimate collector. This is what you want in a collector. Somebody who's passionate, that's connected to the works, that will do anything to try and elevate the artist and the oeuvre, and will do anything he can, like tonight, to bring people together to talk about one of his ancestors.
And I will say, in terms of your work, Pierre-Olivier, when Pierre-Olivier talked about wanting to write the book, one of the things that was so special in this instance is that there was a collection of incredible Raphael works that were in one place that could be drawn on, in addition to works that were across the country at different museums. And so it's been a real special opportunity to be able to work with this incredible collection, as well as works that are across the country. I'm going to let the audience ask some questions, but before I do want to say a special thanks to the book sponsors. And at the Art Canada Institute, we're a not-for-profit organization, and everything we do depends on the generosity of sponsorship. And so the sponsors for William Raphael Life and Work, and I hope everybody has a look at it because it's magnificent, are Jonathan Wiener. They are also the Alan and Pat Covell Foundation, the Schulich Foundation, the Jack Weinbaum Family Foundation, the Azrieli Foundation, the Delaney Family Foundation, the D.H. Gales Family Foundation, the Spatz Family Foundation, and contributors Peter and Mary Slan and the Weiss family. And again, thanks to all of them, many of them here, who made this possible. Thanks to all of you in the audience for coming out tonight to hear about this fantastic book. Thanks to Clarence and Pierre-Olivier.